So my name is Sai Vennam, and I'm a developer advocate and offering manager with IBM. And I also create a lot of YouTube videos, so around Kubernetes and cloud computing and containerization concepts. So I'm really excited to be here in Sydney. I want to thank you all for having me. Today, really quickly, we're going to be talking about multi-cluster strategies, and then you all can go ahead and grab a drink. So I'll go ahead and keep this short. Now, multi-cluster is a growing pattern. If you've seen success with a single cluster, chances are you're going to start scaling it up to even more. Now, I was recently at KubeCon San Diego, where there was a very interesting talk about a company who was scaling up with a single Kubernetes cluster to over 7,000, 8,000 nodes. At that point, things start to degrade. In their case, it was etcd. So you could try to stick with one cluster and keep scaling it infinitely, but chances are you're going to start running into problems. And the correct pattern to scale from there is to start thinking about multiple clusters. I like to start with a number. It's 93%. That's the number of companies out there that are using multiple infrastructure clouds. I'll add on to that with another number, 81%. That's the number of companies that are using multiple public clouds and one or more private or dedicated clouds. Now, this is according to the 2019 IDC Multi-Cloud Management Survey. Now, the key takeaway from this is that companies are trying to avoid vendor lock-in. They're clearly going towards a pattern where they take advantage of multiple cloud environments. But this all goes to say that companies are doing multi-cloud, not particularly multi-cluster. But I think this is where Kubernetes comes in. Companies are avoiding vendor lock-in, and Kubernetes being an open source, community-driven solution that gives you consistency across multiple clusters, it's a sweet spot for Kubernetes in multi-cluster and multi-cloud. To start thinking about why you'd want to have multiple clusters, we'll start with a simple example. DevOps. Let's say your development team has a single cluster. Your testing team should also get their own cluster to test with. And finally, you want a production cluster to run and kind of have those assets accessible for your end users. Now, that's a simple one. That's 3 clusters off the bat. Next, let's start thinking about multi-region, or HA. So say we want to deploy prod environments in both Seoul and Sydney. Maybe we have end users in those areas, so we want to be more localized, have the global load balancer that leads them there. And in addition, let's say just in case one of those clusters or apps goes down, you can fail over to a cluster in a different region. It's another reason, and you can start to see the number of clusters can go up. Now, the last reason is one that we've already talked about, and that's multi-cloud. Let's say you have all of this running in a single cloud. Well, chances are, as a customer, you guys are thinking about using multiple clouds, 81% like we saw. So when you start scaling this out to different clouds where you can take advantage of their own advantages, each cloud has their own set of advantages and tooling that's built and kind of customized to their solution, you start to see the problem. You have multiple clusters across multiple regions. Let's break it down a little bit further. Kubernetes has solved this problem on a smaller scale, right? So with worker nodes, if you're an operations team or you're an operator on an operations team and you're trying to deploy an asset across those worker nodes, gone are the days where you have to worry about where and scheduling out where you want to run those assets, scaling them up and down. You just tell Kubernetes you want it, and it takes care of the rest for you. But what happens when you start having more clusters? It's starting to look very familiar with what Kubernetes does with worker nodes. These are kind of starting to look like a layer that needs another abstraction on top. So when you start thinking about multiple clusters, you start thinking, hey, I need another abstraction layer. Now, one of the first things you'll probably want is a visibility layer. So basically, the ability to see what's running and where it's running. So your pods, deployments, and that kind of thing. In addition, you might be thinking about what version are all my clusters? Are there any of them that are down? Next, you start to think, hey, I want to be able to automate the deployment to federate out Kubernetes resources. Things like pods, services, deployments, maybe even network policies. Then you start to realize I need a federation API server. Now, in a perfect world, that visibility layer would pull that data from the API server as well. Now, the last layer that you need here is kind of a different problem than what we talked about with the federation API server. It's microservice management. So this is something where a service mesh can really excel and help you solve this across clusters. So as an example, let's say a service running in Seoul goes down, and all of the other services that are dependent on it can now fail over to a different service in a different region. Now, these are flows that you can manage with something like a service mesh. So my goal today is to talk about kind of some of the capabilities that are out there, because all of these capabilities, all these challenges that I laid out here, they all need a control plane. Now, some of the solutions out there today are helping tackle exactly what you need. But as we've seen, the problem is in kind of a different part of the overall technology stack. So I'll start with introducing KubeFed. KubeFed is actually sponsored by a Kubernetes special interest group. So it's called SIG Multicluster. Now, they're currently in alpha, and they've gone through a couple of iterations. If you'll remember, they started off with something called Kubernetes, and that then became KubeFed version 1, which is now deprecated. Now they're on to version 2. Now, if you want a community-driven solution to do multi-cluster and multi-cluster capabilities, this is the best way to get it. And right now, they have a survey out where they're trying to identify from consumers like you what they need to develop. What are the capabilities that consumers really need? So get on their Slack channel, Google SIG Multicluster. If you want a community-driven solution for multi-cluster, this is a great place to get started. Next, we've got RASI. So over the years, IBM has been running over now 20,000 clusters in production. And we've picked up on some key tips and solutions and capabilities that we've built in-house to solve how to manage that many clusters. And we realized, hey, let's contribute this to the community. So RASI is something that we announced recently, actually at KubeCon Barcelona, and it's a multi-cluster continuous delivery tool for Kubernetes. So when we run that many clusters in production, we need to be able to know what versions they are all, we need to be able to know if they're running, if they're healthy, and all of those kind of things. We need to get that visibility, but then also do things like pushing out new secrets or certificates or network policies. And you can get started with that today at rasi.io. The last one I want to mention here is Istio. Istio is actually an open source project, as you guys might know. It's a service mesh that allows you to connect, secure, control, and observe services. It's fairly complex, so I won't go into too much detail here today, but it actually started off as a group of 3 different projects. So essentially, it was at a KubeCon event. Some Google engineers, IBM engineers, and Lyft engineers got together, and they realized if we put some of these solutions together, so IBM had Amalgamate, Lyft had Envoy, and people are still continuing to use Envoy today, and Google contributed the service control plane. With those 3 capabilities together, Istio was born. And I'm actually running a co-located event tomorrow where we're going to be talking all about Istio. So if you're interested, there is currently a wait list, but I believe for the afternoon session, you guys should be able to get in if you're interested in getting hands-on and learning more about Istio. But with Istio, there's been a lot of evaluation and even production use within single clusters. But from the beginning, the community and companies have identified that they would like a service mesh to span multiple clusters. So they've started creating multi-cluster capabilities in Istio. I still have a minute and a half, so I'm not sure what that was about. All right, so the multi-cluster capabilities that are coming out in Istio so far have been experimental, but with the latest version 1.4, they actually have a CLI tool where you can get started and start playing with them right now. And I want to overview what that looks like really quickly. So today you can use kubectl to connect up to multiple clusters. And you can kind of see this here. I get the context, I'm connected up to 3 clusters. Next, I'll create a topology YAML. This is basically telling Istio what clusters I want to be meshed together and then what networks they're in. So 2 clusters are on the same network, and the 3rd one is on a separate network. And finally, I'll run this experimental command, so istioctl-x for experimental, multi-cluster apply, and it'll start pulling all of those clusters together into the same mesh. And then it'll do some of the heavy lifting for you to connect up some of those apps and services. So if I deploy the same version of an app to all of those clusters, and then I say, if I kill one of the services in one of the clusters, it'll actually fail over and start running those from some of the other ones. So very quickly, to kind of highlight those 3 capabilities we talked about on that architecture diagram, KubeFed is doing that federation capability, so automating resources and deployment of them. RASI is doing a little bit of that, but has a focus on visibility and seeing what's running where. And then finally, we have Istio that's solving that service mesh multi-cluster layer between multiple clusters. At the end of the day, it's important to start thinking about your multi-cluster strategy today. If you're using a single cluster successfully, chances are you're going to mature and start using more. With a unified control plane, you can gain visibility, see what's running where. You can automate deployments and Kubernetes resources across multiple clusters. And finally, you can manage network traffic between microservices. That's all the time I have for today. I hope this was useful. Definitely check out the Istio workshop that we're doing tomorrow. And if you're interested in learning more about IBM Cloud or maybe just Kubernetes, cloud computing concepts, just open source technologies, check out our YouTube channel on youtube.com/IBMCloud, where you guys may recognize some of the videos that we've put out there. Thank you so much for having me, Sydney.